Hello everyone, before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the whispers of the unknown guide you through the eerie corridors of our story. Ready to face the darkness? The ridge forest stretched endlessly beneath the twilight sky, a labyrinth of towering pines shrouded in an eerie stillness. The dense canopy overhead allowed only faint streaks of fading sunlight to pierce through, casting long, jagged shadows across the forest floor. Each gust of wind sent the branches swaying and whispering to one another, creating a symphony of murmurs that seemed alive with secrets. The air carried a sharp chill, heavy with the scent of damp earth and resin, a constant reminder of the forest's untamed, primal nature. The town of Red Cedar nestled at the edge of this vast wilderness, a collection of rustic cabins and weathered storefronts that seemed dwarfed by the forest's looming presence. For the residents of Red Cedar, the ridge was both a blessing and a curse. Its fertile soil and abundant wildlife sustained the community, but its enigmatic depths had always been a source of unease. Whispers of ancient spirits and shadowy figures had been passed down through generations, warnings cloaked in myth and superstition. At the center of these stories was a legend that had persisted since time immemorial: the Watcher. According to the elders, the Watcher was a guardian spirit, a towering entity born of the forest itself. Its purpose was to maintain balance, to ensure the natural world thrived in harmony with humankind. But when that balance was disrupted, when humans took more than they gave, the spirit would exact its vengeance. It was said that the glowing eyes of the Watcher were the last thing seen by those who dared to defile the forest. Most dismissed the legend as mere folklore, a tale spun to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But for those who had lived their entire lives in Red Cedar, the forest's aura of unease was impossible to ignore. Hikers spoke of being watched, hunters found themselves lost in familiar terrain, and every so often, someone vanished without a trace. The elders would shake their heads knowingly, muttering that the Watcher had claimed another. Ethan Redhawk stood at the edge of the forest, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line as the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon. A seasoned forest ranger and skilled tracker, Ethan was no stranger to the ridge's secrets. His Navajo heritage gave him a unique connection to the land, one that he respected deeply, even if he didn't fully believe the old stories. For Ethan, the forest was a living, breathing entity, but one governed by natural laws, not the whims of vengeful spirits. Tonight, however, felt different. The ridge seemed to hum with a low, throbbing energy, an almost imperceptible vibration that set his nerves on edge. The air was unnaturally still, the usual cacophony of insects and birds replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the trees appeared to lean inward, as if conspiring against him. Ethan adjusted the strap of his gear pack and sighed, his breath visible in the cool night air. "It's just another night," he muttered to himself, though the words rang hollow. He couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. Earlier that day, Ethan had been called to investigate a series of unusual occurrences in the forest. Farmers on the outskirts of town had reported finding mutilated livestock, their bodies arranged in bizarre patterns that defied explanation. Hikers claimed to hear whispers in the wind, voices that seemed to call their names but vanished when they turned to look. And then there were the claw marks, deep, jagged gouges carved into the trunks of trees, higher than any known animal could reach. The most unsettling report, however, came from an old trapper named Bill Grayson. Bill was a pragmatic man, not one given to flights of fancy. Yet when he stumbled into town 2 nights ago, pale and shaking, he spoke of glowing eyes watching him from the darkness, following him as he fled the ridge. "It ain't no bear," he had insisted, his voice trembling. "Ain't no cougar neither. It's something else. Something that don't belong here." Ethan had listened patiently, jotting down notes as Bill recounted his encounter. Privately, he chalked it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination. The ridge was a place of extremes, and fear had a way of amplifying the unknown. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing number of similar accounts. Something was happening in the forest, and it was his job to find out what. underscore 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 underscore. The trail was faint, but Ethan's trained eyes picked up the signs: broken branches, subtle indentations in the soil, and faint scratches on nearby rocks. He moved cautiously, his senses heightened as he ventured deeper into the ridge. The forest seemed to close in around him, the towering pines creating an almost claustrophobic tunnel that swallowed the light of his headlamp. As he followed the trail, Ethan's thoughts drifted to the elder's warnings. Grandfather Nez, the village's most respected elder, had always spoken of the ridge with reverence and caution. "The forest has eyes," he would say, "and it remembers." Ethan had dismissed the words as metaphorical wisdom, but now they echoed in his mind, taking on a chilling literalness. He paused to examine a tree with fresh claw marks, his gloved fingers tracing the grooves. They were deep and precise, as if made by something with incredible strength and intelligence. His gaze flicked upward, scanning the canopy for movement, but the darkness revealed nothing. A sudden rustling to his left made him freeze. Slowly, he turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. The sound grew louder, closer, until a shape burst from the underbrush. Ethan exhaled in relief as a deer darted past him, its eyes wide with panic. "Easy, Red Hawk," he muttered, lowering his knife. But the relief was short-lived. The deer's behavior wasn't normal, it was fleeing something. And that something was likely still nearby. Ethan continued along the trail, his unease growing with each step. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the forest floor. He reached a small clearing and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. In the center of the clearing lay a circle of stones, their surfaces etched with symbols he didn't recognize. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. At the edge of the clearing stood a lone figure, shrouded in shadow. Ethan's heart raced as he raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The figure stepped forward, revealing itself to be Grandfather Nez. The elder's face was lined with worry, his eyes sharp despite his age. "You shouldn't be here, Ethan," Nez said, his voice steady but heavy with warning. Ethan lowered the flashlight, his brow furrowed. "What are you doing out here, Grandfather? It's dangerous." Nez shook his head. "Dangerous for you, maybe. Not for me." He gestured to the glowing stones. "Do you know what this is?" Ethan shook his head. "I was hoping you could tell me." Nez stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the symbols. "This is a marker. A boundary between our world and theirs. The Watcher does not cross without reason." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying this is about the legend? About the Watcher?" Nez met his gaze, his expression grim. "It is no legend, Ethan. The Watcher is real. And it is angry." The elder's words hung heavy in the air as Ethan processed their implications. He had always respected the old stories, but hearing Nez speak of the Watcher with such certainty made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "What does it want?" Ethan asked finally. "Balance," Nez replied. "The forest is out of harmony. The land has been taken, stripped, and poisoned. The Watcher seeks to restore what was lost." Ethan glanced at the glowing stones. "And what happens if we don't stop it?" Nez's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then it will judge us all." The elder placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm. "You are a guardian, Ethan. It is in your blood. The forest chose you, just as it chose me. If you fail, there will be no one left to protect this place." Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of responsibility settling over him. He had always seen himself as a protector of the land, but this was something far beyond his understanding. Still, he knew he couldn't walk away. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his resolve. Nez nodded, his expression softening. "Then may the forest guide you, my son." As Nez disappeared into the shadows, Ethan turned back to the glowing stones, his jaw set in determination. The Ridge Forest was alive with secrets, and he was about to uncover them all. Ethan Redhawk was not the kind of man who sought attention, nor was he one to avoid his responsibilities. Standing at 6 feet tall with a lean, rugged frame hardened by years of physical labor, Ethan moved through life with a quiet confidence. His sharp, dark eyes reflected a mix of intelligence and wariness, a combination that came from a lifetime spent straddling two worlds, the modern one of practicality and reason, and the ancestral one of stories and spirits. Born to a Navajo father and a white mother, Ethan's upbringing was a blend of traditions and contradictions. His father, Thomas Redhawk, was a deeply spiritual man, a storyteller who believed in the power of the old ways. He would sit by the fire on cold desert nights, recounting tales of skinwalkers, protective spirits, and the delicate balance between man and nature. Ethan's mother, Margaret, was an environmental scientist, a woman of logic and reason who believed every mystery had an explanation rooted in data. Together, they taught Ethan to respect both the tangible and the intangible, but it was his father's stories that stayed with him, even as he grew older and more skeptical. Now in his early 30s, Ethan found himself working as a forest ranger for the Ridge Forest Preserve, a sprawling expanse of wilderness that bordered his hometown of Red Cedar. The job suited him perfectly. It allowed him to spend his days surrounded by the untamed beauty of nature, far from the noise and chaos of the modern world. He was a skilled tracker and survivalist, qualities honed through years of exploring the wilderness with his father. But what truly set Ethan apart was his connection to the land, a connection he often dismissed as instinct but which others, especially the tribal elders, saw as something much deeper. Ethan's routine days were filled with patrols through the forest, ensuring hikers stayed on marked trails, monitoring wildlife populations, and occasionally rescuing lost adventurers who underestimated the ridge's vastness. Despite the occasional excitement, it was a solitary life, one he preferred. The forest, with its towering pines and endless shadows, was his sanctuary. But even in the solace of the woods, Ethan couldn't escape the whispers of his heritage. The elders of the Navajo community often spoke of his role as a guardian, a protector chosen by the land itself. Grandfather Nez, the oldest and most respected elder, had once told him, "You have the eyes of a hawk and the heart of a wolf, Ethan. The ridge sees you as one of its own. Don't ignore that." Ethan had laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to the poetic musings of an old man. But as the years went on, he couldn't deny the strange sense of belonging he felt in the forest, as if the land recognized him in some inexplicable way. It was this connection that brought Ethan to the attention of the townsfolk whenever something unusual happened in the ridge. Over the years, he had become the unofficial mediator between the town and the forest, the one people turned to when the natural world seemed to blur into the supernatural. Most of the time, the incidents were mundane, reports of strange noises that turned out to be owls, sightings of shadowy figures that were just play of light and trees. Ethan would patiently investigate each claim, reassure the townsfolk, and move on. But lately, the reports had taken on a darker tone. It started with the livestock. Farmers on the outskirts of town found their animals dead, their bodies arranged in bizarre patterns that defied explanation. Then came the hikers, seasoned adventurers who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only abandoned campsites and faint footprints that led nowhere. And finally, the claw marks, deep, jagged grooves carved into tree trunks, higher than any known animal could reach. The culmination of these events was a meeting in the town hall, where the townsfolk gathered to air their fears and frustrations. Ethan stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, as they debated whether to involve state authorities or even close the forest to visitors. It was Grandfather Nez who silenced the room with his quiet but commanding voice. "The Watcher is stirring," the elder said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "The balance has been broken, and the forest remembers. This is not a matter for outsiders. This is our burden to bear." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Ethan felt the weight of the elder's words, though he remained skeptical. He didn't believe in vengeful spirits or guardian entities, but he couldn't deny that something was happening in the ridge, something he didn't yet understand. Ethan's skepticism was tested that very night. After the meeting, he returned to his small cabin on the edge of the forest, intent on getting some rest before his morning patrol. But sleep didn't come easily. The events of the past weeks played over and over in his mind, and the unease he felt during the meeting lingered like a shadow in the corner of the room. At some point after midnight, a sound pulled him from the edge of sleep. It was faint but persistent, a rhythmic tapping on his window. Groggy and annoyed, Ethan grabbed a flashlight and approached the window, expecting to find a branch swaying in the wind. But when he pulled back the curtain, his blood ran cold. Two glowing eyes stared back at him from the darkness, unblinking and impossibly bright. They hovered at a height that no animal could reach, and their intensity seemed to pierce through him, filling him with a primal fear he couldn't explain. Ethan froze, his hand gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They simply watched. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan mustered the courage to throw open the door and shine the flashlight into the yard. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. No tracks, no movement, no sign that anything had been there at all. Shaken, Ethan closed the door and locked it, something he hadn't done in years. He spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the room, his knife within arm's reach and his heart pounding like a drum. The following morning, Ethan shared his experience with grandfather Nez. The elder listened intently, nodding as Ethan described the glowing eyes and the suffocating fear they inspired. "It has chosen you," Nez said simply, his tone matter-of-fact. "Chosen me for what?" Ethan asked, his frustration evident. "I'm a ranger, not some spirit warrior." Nez placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm despite his age. "You are a guardian, Ethan. The forest knows this, even if you do not. The ridge is waking, and you must decide whether to answer its call." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had spent his entire life walking the line between belief and skepticism, between honoring his heritage and embracing the rational world. But now, faced with something he couldn't explain, he realized he couldn't ignore the pull of the forest any longer. "I'll do what I can," he said finally, though the words felt inadequate. Nez smiled faintly, his eyes filled with a mix of pride and sorrow. "That is all the forest asks." As Ethan prepared for his next patrol, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. The Ridge Forest was no longer just a sanctuary or a place of work, it was a living, breathing entity, and it had chosen him to be its guardian. Whether he believed in the old stories or not, one thing was certain: the forest was calling, and he had no choice but to answer. The Ridge Forest had always been a place of quiet power, but in recent weeks, that power had begun to shift. Ethan Redhawk felt it in the way the air grew heavier with each passing day, how the shadows beneath the towering pines seemed darker, more alive. He saw it in the faces of the townsfolk who came to him, their eyes wide with fear and their voices trembling with unspoken questions. Ethan had spent his career as a forest ranger listening to people's concerns about the ridge. Missing hikers, strange lights, and eerie sounds were nothing new to him. Usually, the answers were mundane: a lost trail marker, a trick of the light, or the cries of nocturnal animals mistaken for something otherworldly. But this time was different. This time, there were no easy answers. It began with the livestock. On the outskirts of Red Cedar, farmers woke to find their animals dead, their bodies arranged in patterns that defied explanation. Cattle were found in perfect circles, their limbs contorted unnaturally, while chickens were placed in straight lines, as though guided by an unseen hand. The farmers whispered of dark rituals, their voices hushed as they pointed accusing fingers toward the ridge. Ethan visited the farms, hoping to offer practical explanations. He examined the carcasses, noting the precision of the wounds and the lack of tracks leading to or from the scenes. No predator could have done this, and the patterns were too deliberate for accidents. When he found a lone feather lodged in a tree, black, glossy, and unnaturally large, he felt a chill he couldn't ignore. "Maybe it's just a rogue bear," Ethan muttered to himself, though he knew better. The claw marks found on nearby trees were impossibly high, far beyond the reach of even the largest grizzly. Something else was moving through the ridge, and it wasn't following the rules of nature. The hikers were next. Red Cedar prided itself on being a gateway for outdoor enthusiasts, and the ridge offered trails that attracted visitors from across the state. But in the span of 2 weeks, 3 experienced hikers had vanished without a trace. Search parties combed the forest, their efforts led by Ethan, but they found nothing except abandoned gear and faint footprints that disappeared into the underbrush. The locals grew restless, their unease bubbling into anger. At a hastily called town meeting, they demanded answers. Some called for the forest to be closed, while others urged the sheriff to bring in federal authorities. But it was Grandfather Nez who silenced the room, his voice steady and resolute. "The Watcher is restless," the elder said, his words carrying the weight of generations. "The balance has been broken. The forest is not angry, it is warning us." Ethan, standing at the back of the room, felt a dozen pairs of eyes turn toward him. He was the town's connection to the ridge, their interpreter of its moods and mysteries. But even he didn't know how to answer the question everyone was asking: what is happening in the forest? That night, Ethan returned to his cabin with a heavy heart. The warnings of the elders echoed in his mind, colliding with the cold logic he'd inherited from his mother. He spent hours reviewing maps, reports, and notes from his patrols, searching for patterns or explanations. But the only thing he found was a deepening sense of dread. At some point after midnight, a knock at his door startled him. Grabbing a flashlight, Ethan opened the door to find Grandfather Nez standing on his porch, his expression grave. "You can feel it, can't you?" Nez asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Ethan nodded, closing the door behind him. "The ridge isn't right. It feels like it's alive. Watching." Nez took a seat by the fire, his hands resting on his cane. "It is alive. And it is watching. The forest is a living thing, Ethan. It remembers the promises made and the promises broken. And it knows when the balance has been tipped too far." "What does it want?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "Restoration," Nez replied. "Harmony. But balance cannot be restored without sacrifice." Ethan frowned, his skepticism flaring. "Sacrifice? You're saying the forest wants blood?" Nez shook his head. "Not blood. Understanding. Respect. The ridge has chosen you, Ethan. You are its guardian, whether you believe it or not." The elder's words weighed on Ethan as he prepared for his next patrol. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something much larger than himself. The ridge was no longer just a place of work, it was a force, an entity that demanded his attention. The stakes became painfully clear during his patrol the following day. Deep in the forest, Ethan stumbled upon a new scene of carnage: a deer, its body arranged in the center of a clearing surrounded by clawed trees. The ground was littered with black feathers, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. As Ethan knelt to examine the scene, a low growl rumbled through the trees. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to the knife on his belt. The growl grew louder, resonating through the forest like a warning. Slowly, he rose to his feet, scanning the shadows for movement. Then he saw them, two glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness. They were larger and brighter than the ones he'd seen outside his cabin, their gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. The growl turned into a roar, and Ethan stumbled back, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he didn't run. Instead, he stood his ground, his pulse hammering in his ears as he locked eyes with the creature. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a rustle of branches, the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone in the clearing. Ethan returned to town shaken but determined. He met with Grandfather Nez that evening, recounting his encounter in the clearing. "It's testing you," Nez said, his tone solemn. "The Watcher doesn't harm without reason. It's waiting to see if you are worthy." "Worthy of what?" Ethan asked, his frustration evident. "To restore what was lost," Nez replied. "The ridge has been violated, its balance shattered. If it cannot be mended, the Watcher will act. And its judgment will not be kind." Ethan leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "How do I stop it?" Nez placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "By listening. By remembering. The answers are in the forest, Ethan. You just have to find them." The weight of responsibility settled over Ethan like a shroud as he left Nez's home. The ridge was no longer just a forest, it was a force of nature, a keeper of ancient secrets and forgotten promises. And Ethan, whether he liked it or not, was the one chosen to face its wrath. As he walked back to his cabin, The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispers. Ethan stopped and turned, scanning the darkness for movement. For a moment, he thought he saw glowing eyes watching him from the tree line. But when he blinked, they were gone. The forest was calling, and Ethan knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The ridge forest felt different as Ethan Redhawk began his next patrol. Though he had walked these trails countless times, the familiar paths now carried an undercurrent of tension. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant call of a bird, seemed amplified, tinged with a sense of foreboding. The air was heavier, the shadows darker, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan had always trusted his instincts. As a ranger, they had saved him from everything from sudden storms to encounters with aggressive wildlife. But this was something new, something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a gnawing sense of anticipation, as though the forest were waiting for him to uncover its secrets. The first sign appeared near the riverbank. Ethan had stopped to refill his canteen when he noticed the tracks. At first glance, they resembled the prints of a large animal, perhaps a bear or a mountain lion. But as he examined them more closely, he realized they were unlike anything he'd seen before. The claws were longer, the pads broader, and the depth of the impressions suggested something impossibly heavy. They trailed off into the trees, disappearing into the dense underbrush. He crouched by the river, tracing one of the prints with his gloved hand. "What are you?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The forest offered no answers, only the soft murmur of the river and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Continuing along the trail, Ethan found more signs. Claw marks raked across the trunks of towering pines, gouging the bark at a height far beyond the reach of any known predator. Branches were snapped cleanly, as though something massive had forced its way through the forest. And then there were the feathers, black and glossy, scattered across the ground like a trail of breadcrumbs. They were larger than any bird native to the area, their edges sharp and pristine. Ethan collected one of the feathers, tucking it into his pack for later examination. It felt oddly warm in his hand, a sensation that sent a chill down his spine. As he moved deeper into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it grew stronger with each step. Nightfall brought a new layer of unease. Ethan set up camp in a small clearing, his tent nestled beneath the protective canopy of a large cedar. He built a fire, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Normally, the sounds of the forest at night were a comfort, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But tonight, the forest was silent. Ethan sat by the fire, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife as he scanned the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the fire. He thought of Grandfather Nez's words, "The forest is alive. And it remembers." A sudden rustling in the underbrush snapped him to attention. He grabbed his flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing. The rustling grew louder, closer, until it stopped abruptly. Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, he saw them, two glowing eyes, large and unblinking, staring at him from the darkness. They hovered at an impossible height, their gaze piercing through the shadows. "Who's there?" Ethan called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move. They simply watched. Ethan stood slowly, his knife in one hand and his flashlight in the other. He took a cautious step forward, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The eyes disappeared, vanishing as suddenly as they had appeared. The rustling resumed, retreating into the forest until it faded into silence. The next morning, Ethan returned to the clearing where he had seen the eyes. The ground was undisturbed, with no tracks or other evidence to suggest anyone or anything had been there. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on him. He continued his patrol, his senses heightened. The signs became more frequent, claw marks gouged into rock, feathers scattered across trails, and broken branches that formed unnatural patterns. In one particularly dense section of the forest, he found a circle of stones arranged with eerie precision. Each stone was etched with symbols he didn't recognize, their surfaces weathered but intact. Ethan knelt by the circle, tracing one of the symbols with his finger. It was a spiral, its lines perfectly even despite the rough surface of the stone. He felt a faint vibration beneath his fingertips, a subtle hum that seemed to resonate through the ground. "What is this place?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The forest, as always, offered no answers. That evening, Ethan met with grandfather Nez to share what he had found. The elder listened intently, his expression grave as Ethan described the tracks, the feathers, and the circle of stones. "The Watcher is near," Nez said finally, his voice heavy with certainty. "The signs are clear. It is testing you, Ethan. Watching to see if you are ready." "Ready for what?" Ethan asked, his frustration evident. "I'm just a ranger, grandfather." "I'm not, whatever it is you think I am." Nez placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm despite his age. "You are a guardian, Ethan. The forest chose you long before you were born. You may not believe it, but the ridge does. And it will not wait for you to catch up." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to argue, to push back against the weight of the elder's words. But deep down, he knew there was truth in them. The forest was calling, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. As Ethan left Nez's home, the night sky stretched above him, a tapestry of stars unmarred by city lights. The ridge loomed in the distance, its silhouette a jagged line against the horizon. For the first time, Ethan felt a sense of purpose beyond his duties as a ranger. The forest was more than his responsibility, it was his destiny. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that sounded almost like whispers. Ethan stopped and turned, scanning the darkness for movement. For a moment, he thought he saw glowing eyes watching him from the tree line. But when he blinked, they were gone. The forest was waiting, and Ethan knew he had to answer its call. The discovery of the tree at the heart of the ridge left Ethan Redhawk with more questions than answers. He spent the next day retracing his steps, searching for anything he might have overlooked. The symbols carved into the bark haunted him, their glowing lines seared into his memory. They weren't just markings, they were messages, fragments of a language he couldn't understand but instinctively knew was significant. Ethan returned to grandfather Nez, the elder who had guided him through so much of the forest's mysteries. Nez's cabin, tucked away at the edge of the ridge, felt like a refuge. The scent of burning sage greeted Ethan as he stepped inside, the smoke curling lazily in the dim light. "You found it," Nez said without turning from the small fire he was tending. His voice was calm, yet it carried an undercurrent of gravity. Ethan nodded, setting the map he had sketched onto the table. "The tree, it's not just a marker, is it? It's something more." Nez gestured for Ethan to sit, his gaze fixed on the flames. "The tree is the heart of the ridge," he explained. "It connects our world to the spirit world. It has stood there for centuries, long before the first settlers arrived. But now, its balance has been disrupted." "By the Watcher?" Ethan asked. Nez shook his head. "By us. By humanity. The Watcher is not the cause, it is the consequence. It is a guardian, born of the forest's anger and pain. When the balance is broken, it awakens to restore harmony, no matter the cost." Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "So how do I fix it? How do I restore balance?" Nez's expression softened, his eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. "To restore balance, you must first understand what was lost. The answers lie in the stories of your ancestors, Ethan. They are your inheritance, the wisdom that has been passed down through generations. Listen to them, and they will guide you." That night, Ethan stayed in the cabin, sitting by the fire as Nez recounted the legends of their people. The elder's voice was steady, each word weaving a tapestry of history and myth. He spoke of a time when the ridge was untouched, its pines towering over a land teeming with life. The people who lived there understood the balance between taking and giving, and they honored the forest with rituals of gratitude and respect. But as the years passed, the harmony was disrupted. Settlers arrived, bringing with them axes and saws, cutting into the forest's heart without regard for the spirits that dwelled within. The tree at the ridge center, once a symbol of connection, became a battleground between man and nature. The Watcher was born from this conflict, Nez said, his voice heavy with sorrow. It is both protector and punisher, a being of immense power that enforces the forest's will. But even it is not immune to corruption. The pain and betrayal of the land have twisted it, turning it into something more dangerous. Ethan stared into the flames, the weight of Nez's words settling over him like a shroud. If the Watcher is corrupted, then what does that mean for me? For the Ridge? Nez placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. It means your role is more important than ever. You are a guardian, Ethan. The forest chose you to be its voice, its bridge between worlds. You must find a way to heal both the Watcher and the land it protects. The next morning, Ethan returned to the Ridge with renewed determination. Guided by the stories Nez had shared, he sought out the symbols he had overlooked before. Each circle of stones, each claw mark, and each scattered feather began to form a narrative, a story of a forest crying out for help. At one site, Ethan discovered a cluster of saplings that had been deliberately arranged in a spiral pattern. The saplings were young, their leaves vibrant and green, but their arrangement felt unnatural, as though someone or something had placed them there with intention. In the center of the spiral lay a small, weathered carving, a figure resembling the Watcher, its eyes inlaid with fragments of amber that glinted in the sunlight. Ethan knelt by the carving, tracing its surface with his fingers. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the lines precise and deliberate. It felt ancient, a relic of a time when the forest's guardians worked in harmony with its human inhabitants. But now, it served as a reminder of what had been lost. As the day wore on, Ethan ventured deeper into the Ridge, following trails that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The forest grew denser, its shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. He felt the Watcher's presence more strongly now, a constant pressure at the edges of his awareness. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was waiting. Ethan's journey led him to a cave nestled at the base of a rocky outcrop. The entrance was partially obscured by hanging vines, their leaves shimmering with dew despite the dry air. Inside, the cave was cool and dim, its walls lined with more of the glowing symbols he had seen before. At the center of the cave stood an altar, hewn from a single piece of black stone. On its surface lay another carving, this one larger and more detailed than the one he had found earlier. The figure of the Watcher was surrounded by smaller figures, their postures supplicating, their hands raised in offering. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he realized the significance of the scene. This wasn't just an altar, it was a place of communion, a space where the guardians of old had come to honor the forest and seek its guidance. He reached out to touch the carving, his fingers brushing against the cool stone. The moment he made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him, filling his mind with images and sounds. He saw the Ridge as it had once been, vibrant and alive, its harmony unbroken. He heard the songs of the forest, melodies that spoke of connection and unity. And then he saw the Watcher, its form uncorrupted, standing as a beacon of protection and balance. But the vision shifted, darkening. The trees withered, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The songs turned to cries of anguish, and the Watcher's form grew monstrous, its glowing eyes filled with rage. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing as the vision faded. The altar remained unchanged, its surface cold and unyielding. But Ethan was changed. He understood now what was at stake, and what he had to do. That night, Ethan returned to the tree at the heart of the Ridge. The journey was arduous, the forest's trails seemingly conspiring against him. But he pressed on, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. When he reached the clearing, he found the Watcher waiting for him, its massive form illuminated by the faint glow of the tree's symbols. Ethan stepped forward, the talisman in his hand. "I know what you are," he said, his voice steady. "And I know why you're here. But this doesn't have to end in destruction. There's another way." The Watcher tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating through Ethan's very bones. He felt the weight of its gaze, the power it wielded, but he didn't waver. "I'm here to restore what was lost," he continued. "To heal the forest, and to heal you. But I can't do it alone." The Watcher let out a low growl, the sound reverberating through the clearing. For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the creature stepped back, its massive form retreating into the shadows. The tree's glow intensified, the symbols pulsing with a rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the forest itself. Ethan knelt by the tree, placing the talisman at its base. He closed his eyes, his thoughts filled with the stories Nez had shared, the visions he had seen, and the connection he now felt to the ridge. The forest was alive, and it had chosen him to be its voice. When he opened his eyes, the clearing was still. The Watcher was gone, but its presence lingered, a silent reminder of the balance that had to be restored. Ethan rose to his feet, his resolve stronger than ever. The encounter at the heart of the ridge had left Ethan Redhawk with a profound sense of clarity, yet an equally profound sense of unease. The forest had spoken to him, not in words, but through its signs, its symbols, and the presence of the Watcher. Still, he knew that understanding was only the beginning. Healing the ridge and the Watcher would demand more than knowledge. It would demand action. Ethan returned to the town of Red Cedar, seeking answers in the stories and records of its oldest inhabitants. He found himself drawn to the library's archives, where dusty volumes and yellowed papers documented the history of the ridge. It was here that he uncovered fragments of a forgotten truth, pieces of a puzzle that connected him to the forest in ways he had never imagined. One evening, as he pored over an old ledger, a name caught his eye: Isaac Redhawk. The entry was brief but significant, mentioning Isaac as a tracker and healer who had lived on the outskirts of the ridge nearly a century ago. The records described him as a man of deep connection to the land, one who worked tirelessly to protect the forest and its balance. Ethan's pulse quickened as he read on. The ledger hinted at a tragedy, a betrayal of trust between Isaac and the settlers who sought to exploit the ridge's resources. Isaac had tried to warn them of the consequences, invoking the legend of the Watcher, but his warnings went unheeded. In the end, the ledger noted cryptically, Isaac passed into the forest, becoming one with its spirit. Ethan leaned back, the weight of the discovery settling over him. Isaac Redhawk was an ancestor, a guardian before him. The forest's connection to his family wasn't just symbolic, it was literal. The ridge had chosen him, just as it had chosen Isaac. Driven by this revelation, Ethan sought out grandfather Nez, who confirmed the story. Nez's voice was tinged with sadness as he recounted the tale. Isaac was the last true guardian of the ridge, Nez said. When he died, the balance was already fractured. The Watcher emerged to fill the void, but its purpose became twisted by the pain of the forest. It has been waiting ever since, searching for a new guardian to restore what was lost. Ethan's jaw tightened. If Isaac couldn't stop this, what chance do I have? Nez placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his gaze steady. You have something Isaac did not, the wisdom of his mistakes. The forest does not ask for perfection, Ethan. It asks for harmony. And that begins with understanding your place within it. Ethan spent the following days preparing for what he now understood to be a ritual of reconciliation. The talisman Nez had given him was a key, but it needed to be empowered with intent. Ethan revisited the circles of stones, the carved symbols, and the spirals of saplings, each time offering small tokens of respect, a prayer, a handful of earth, a whispered promise to protect the ridge. As he moved through the forest, he felt the Watcher's presence growing stronger. It no longer felt entirely hostile. There was a sense of curiosity, even cautious acceptance. The forest, too, seemed to respond to his efforts. The air grew lighter, the shadows less oppressive. Birds returned to the trees, their songs tentative but hopeful. The final piece of the ritual came in a vision. One night, as Ethan rested by the fire, he was overcome by a wave of drowsiness. He closed his eyes and found himself standing in a meadow bathed in moonlight. The Watcher stood before him, its glowing eyes less menacing now, more searching. Isaac Redhawk. His ancestor's form was faint, shimmering like the light on a rippling stream, but his expression was one of peace. You carry our blood, Isaac said, his voice echoing like the wind through the pines. And with it, our responsibility. The forest is not yours to control, Ethan. It is yours to protect, as it protects you. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I don't know if I'm strong enough, he admitted. Isaac's faint smile was reassuring. Strength comes from connection. Listen to the forest, to its rhythms and needs. It will guide you, as it guided me. The vision faded, leaving Ethan with a profound sense of calm. He woke to find the fire still burning low, its embers glowing softly in the pre-dawn light. The talisman in his hand felt warm, almost alive, as if it, too, had been touched by the vision. Ethan's preparations culminated in a journey back to the tree at the heart of the ridge. This time, he carried more than the talisman. He carried offerings, a pouch of herbs Nez had prepared, a carved wooden figure of the Watcher he had made himself, and a bundle of Isaac's belongings that Nez had kept safe over the years. The forest seemed to welcome him as he walked, the trails clear and the air filled with the gentle rustling of leaves. When he reached the clearing, the Watcher was already there, its massive form illuminated by the tree's glowing symbols. But this time, it did not growl or advance. It simply watched. Ethan knelt at the base of the tree, arranging the offerings with care. He placed the talisman at the center, its carved lines glowing faintly in response to the tree's light. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "I am Ethan Redhawk," he said, his voice steady. "Guardian of the Ridge, descendant of Isaac Redhawk. I come not to challenge you, but to honor you. To honor this forest and the balance we have forgotten." The tree's symbols pulsed, the glow spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The Watcher tilted its head, its glowing eyes fixed on Ethan. The air hummed with energy, the vibrations resonating through the ground and into Ethan's very core. "I offer this," Ethan continued, placing Isaac's belongings at the base of the tree. "A reminder of what we once were, and a promise of what we can be again." The Watcher stepped closer, its towering form casting a shadow over Ethan. It reached out with one massive claw, touching the talisman with a delicate precision that belied its size. The glow intensified, enveloping the clearing in light so bright that Ethan had to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the Watcher was gone. The tree stood tall and unmarked, its symbols now dormant but whole. The clearing felt different, as if the forest itself had exhaled a long-held breath. Ethan rose to his feet, his heart pounding. He didn't know if the Watcher's absence was permanent, but he felt its approval, its trust. The ridge had accepted him as its guardian, and with that acceptance came a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. The journey back to Red Cedar was quiet, the forest alive with the sounds of renewal. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the distant hum of insects filled the air. Ethan felt the weight of his role, but also its privilege. He was not just a ranger or a descendant of guardians past. He was a part of the ridge, as much as the trees, the stones, and the creatures that called it home. When he reached Nez's cabin, the elder was waiting, his expression one of quiet pride. "The forest is at peace," Nez said. "And so, too, are you." Ethan nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "For now. But the work isn't over." "It never is," Nez replied. "But you are ready." As Ethan turned to leave, he felt the faintest whisper of a presence behind him. He glanced back at the forest, catching a glimpse of glowing eyes in the shadows. But this time, they were not threatening. They were watching, waiting, and perhaps even approving. The ridge had found its guardian, and Ethan Redhawk had found his purpose. The ridge forest was silent as Ethan Redhawk prepared himself for the final confrontation. The air was thick, not just with humidity but with a palpable tension that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. He had spent weeks unraveling the forest's secrets, piecing together its history, and discovering his role as its guardian. Now, all that knowledge would be tested. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing where the great tree, the heart of the ridge, rose like a sentinel. The tree's bark glowed faintly, its ancient symbols pulsating with an inner light that seemed to mirror the steady beat of his own heart. In his hand, he held the talisman Grandfather Nez had entrusted to him, its carved lines warm against his skin. The clearing was quiet, save for the distant rustle of leaves. But Ethan knew better than to trust the calm. The Watcher was near, its presence a heavy weight pressing down on him. He could feel its gaze even before it appeared, a sensation like the prickling of static electricity on his skin. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped into the clearing, his boots crunching softly on the forest floor. The tree loomed above him, its branches twisting skyward like reaching arms. The symbols etched into its bark flared briefly as he approached, as though acknowledging his arrival. "I'm here," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Show yourself." For a moment, Nothing happened. The forest remained still, the silence stretching thin and taut. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, the Watcher emerged. The creature was larger than Ethan remembered, its form a grotesque blend of shadow and sinew. Its glowing eyes burned like twin embers, piercing through the darkness with an intensity that made Ethan's chest tighten. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural heat, distorting its edges and making it seem both solid and ephemeral. The Watcher stepped forward, its movements deliberate and fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. Each step sent ripples through the ground, the vibrations resonating in Ethan's bones. It stopped just short of the talisman's protective aura, its head tilting as it regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and menace. Ethan stood his ground, the talisman held firmly in his grip. "I know what you are," he said, his voice firm. "And I know why you're here. But this doesn't have to end in destruction." The Watcher let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the clearing like a distant thunderclap. Its eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Ethan thought it might attack. But instead, it began to circle him, its massive form moving with an unnerving grace. "You were created to protect this forest," Ethan continued, turning to keep the creature in his line of sight. "But the pain of what's been done here has twisted you. I understand that now. And I'm here to make it right." The Watcher stopped abruptly, its gaze locking onto the talisman in Ethan's hand. It let out a snarl, the sound sharp and guttural. The ground beneath Ethan's feet trembled, cracks spidering outward from where he stood. The talisman flared with light, its glow intensifying as it absorbed the energy of the forest. The confrontation escalated quickly. The Watcher lunged, its clawed hand swiping toward Ethan with blinding speed. Ethan dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack. The ground where he had stood exploded in a shower of dirt and debris, the force of the blow leaving a deep gouge in the earth. Scrambling to his feet, Ethan raised the talisman, its light forming a protective barrier around him. The Watcher recoiled, its roar echoing through the clearing as it clawed at the air, trying to breach the barrier. Ethan took the opportunity to chant the words Grandfather Nez had taught him, the ancient incantation flowing from his lips with a power that seemed to come from the forest itself. The symbols on the tree began to glow brighter, their light spreading outward in intricate patterns that covered the ground. The Watcher hesitated, its movements faltering as the symbols encircled it. It let out a furious roar, the sound carrying a note of desperation that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "You're not my enemy," Ethan said, his voice rising over the chaos. "You're a part of this forest, just like me. But this isn't the way to protect it." The Watcher's glowing eyes fixed on him, its form flickering as though caught between solidity and shadow. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw something human in its gaze, a flicker of recognition, a trace of sorrow. But the moment passed, and the creature roared again, its rage unrelenting. Ethan pressed forward, the talisman's light growing stronger with each step. He could feel the forest responding to his efforts, its energy surging through him like a current. The symbols on the tree pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, their glow illuminating the clearing in a soft, golden light. The Watcher lunged again, its claws slicing through the air inches from Ethan's face. This time, he didn't dodge. Instead, he raised the talisman, its light meeting the creature's attack head-on. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, the force of it knocking Ethan backward. He landed hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. Gasping for breath, he looked up to see the Watcher writhing, its form surrounded by a halo of light. The creature's snarls turned to anguished howls, its movements frantic as it tried to escape the talisman's energy. Ethan struggled to his feet, his body aching but his resolve unshaken. The Watcher stilled, its glowing eyes narrowing as it regarded him. The light around it seemed to waver, its intensity dimming. Ethan stepped closer, the talisman held high. "I know what you've lost," he continued, his voice softening. "And I know how much it hurts. But if we keep fighting, this forest will never heal. Let me help you." The clearing fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. The Watcher's form flickered, its edges blurring as though it were being pulled in multiple directions at once. Ethan could feel its struggle, the war within it between rage and reason, between destruction and renewal. The talisman flared one final time, its light encompassing the entire clearing. The symbols on the tree pulsed in unison, their glow spreading outward like ripples on a pond. Ethan closed his eyes, his thoughts filled with the stories Nez had shared, the visions he had seen, and the connection he now felt to the ridge. When he opened his eyes, the Watcher was still. Its form had shifted, its once monstrous features now softened. The glowing eyes remained, but they no longer burned with anger. Instead, they held a quiet sadness, a recognition of the pain it had caused and the pain it had endured. Ethan lowered the talisman, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's not too late," he said. "We can still make this right." The Watcher stared at him for a long moment before stepping back, its massive form retreating into the shadows. The tree's glow dimmed, its symbols fading into the bark as the clearing grew still once more. Ethan sank to his knees, exhaustion washing over him. He had faced the Watcher and survived, but he knew the battle was far from over. The forest had begun to heal, but its wounds were deep, and its balance fragile. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, Ethan rose to his feet, the talisman still warm in his hand. The ridge had tested him, and he had proven himself. But the true challenge lay ahead, ensuring that the forest's harmony would never again be broken. Ethan Redhawk stood in the clearing, the talisman's faint glow casting long shadows across the ground. The forest around him was alive with an energy he had never felt before, a thrumming pulse that seemed to come from the very earth itself. The Watcher had retreated, but its presence lingered, a dark and oppressive weight that pressed against Ethan's mind. He knew this was not the end, it was merely a pause before the storm. The heart tree stood tall and unyielding at the center of the clearing, its glowing symbols pulsing with a steady rhythm. Ethan stepped closer, his hand gripping the talisman tightly. He could feel the forest's power surging through him, a connection that both comforted and terrified him. The ridge had chosen him, but the question remained, was he strong enough to see this through? As if in answer, the shadows at the edge of the clearing began to shift. The Watcher reappeared, its massive form emerging from the darkness like a living nightmare. Its glowing eyes burned with an intensity that made Ethan's chest tighten, and its presence seemed to drain the light from the air. Ethan raised the talisman, its glow brightening in response to the Watcher's approach. The creature let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the clearing. It circled him slowly, its movements deliberate and predatory. "You don't have to do this," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his resolve. "I know you're not just a monster. You're a guardian, like me. Let's end this together." The Watcher paused, tilting its massive head as if considering his words. For a moment, the glow in its eyes dimmed, and Ethan dared to hope. But then the creature let out a deafening roar, its form shifting as it lunged toward him. The ground trembled beneath its weight, and the air crackled with energy as the battle truly began. The first strike came like a lightning bolt. The Watcher's massive claw slashed through the air, aiming directly for Ethan. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blow as the talisman flared brightly, forming a protective barrier around him. The force of the attack sent shockwaves through the clearing, splintering nearby trees and scattering leaves like confetti. Ethan rolled to his feet, his heart pounding as he faced the creature. The talisman pulsed in his hand, its energy flowing into him like a lifeline. He began to chant, the words taught to him by Grandfather Nez spilling from his lips with an urgency that matched the chaos around him. The symbols on the heart tree responded to his chant, their glow intensifying until the entire clearing was bathed in light. The Watcher howled in pain, its shadowy form writhing as the light seared through it. But the creature was not so easily defeated. It regrouped quickly, its glowing eyes narrowing with determination. With a roar, the Watcher unleashed a wave of shadowy tendrils that shot toward Ethan like spears. He raised the talisman, its light creating a shield that deflected the attack. The tendrils dissolved into mist upon contact, but the force of the assault pushed Ethan back several steps. "You're stronger than this," Ethan shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. "You're not just a creature of vengeance. You're a protector. Remember who you are." The Watcher hesitated, its form flickering as if torn between its instincts and Ethan's words. For a brief moment, the oppressive weight in the air lifted, and the creature's eyes softened. But the respite was short-lived. With a guttural growl, the Watcher surged forward, its claws aiming for Ethan's chest. Ethan braced himself, the talisman's light forming a protective dome around him. The Watcher's claws struck the barrier with a thunderous crash, the impact sending cracks spidering through the glowing shield. Ethan gritted his teeth, his arms trembling as he poured every ounce of his willpower into maintaining the barrier. The heart tree's symbols pulsed in rhythm with the talisman, their light growing brighter as if lending Ethan their strength. He could feel the forest's energy surging through him, a connection that went beyond words or logic. This was not a battle of strength alone, it was a battle of will. As the Watcher pressed against the barrier, Ethan focused on the memories of his journey. He thought of Grandfather Nez's teachings, of the visions of Isaac Redhawk, and of the forest's quiet beauty before it had been scarred by greed and neglect. These thoughts gave him strength, grounding him in the purpose that had brought him here. "You're not my enemy," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the strain. "You're a part of this forest, just like I am. We're not so different, you and I." The Watcher roared in defiance, but its movements faltered. The cracks in the barrier began to heal as the talisman's light grew brighter, pushing the creature back step by step. Ethan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening as he stepped forward. The battle shifted as Ethan went on the offensive. He moved with purpose, the talisman guiding his actions as he chanted the words of the ritual. The symbols on the heart tree flared in response, their light creating beams that struck the Watcher with pinpoint accuracy. The creature howled, its form flickering and shrinking as the light tore through it. But the Watcher was not finished. With a final, desperate roar, it unleashed a surge of dark energy that engulfed the clearing. The light from the heart tree dimmed, and Ethan was thrown to the ground, the talisman slipping from his grasp. The air grew thick with shadow, the oppressive weight threatening to crush him. Ethan struggled to his feet, his body aching from the force of the attack. He searched frantically for the talisman, its faint glow barely visible amidst the darkness. The Watcher loomed over him, its form massive and terrifying in the absence of light. "You think this will stop me?" Ethan said, his voice defiant. "I've come too far to give up now." Summoning every ounce of his strength, he lunged for the talisman, his fingers closing around its glowing surface. The instant he touched it, a surge of energy coursed through him, reigniting the light and banishing the shadows. The heart tree's symbols blazed to life once more, their light piercing through the darkness like the dawn breaking over the horizon. The Watcher let out a final, anguished roar as its form began to dissolve, the shadowy tendrils unraveling and fading into the night. Ethan stood in the center of the clearing, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. The Watcher was gone, its presence reduced to a faint hum that lingered in the air. The talisman's glow had dimmed, but its warmth remained, a reminder of the bond he now shared with the forest. The heart tree stood tall and unbroken, its symbols pulsing with a gentle light that spoke of renewal. The forest around him was silent, but it was not the oppressive silence of before. This was a silence filled with peace, with the promise of healing and rebirth. Ethan sank to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had faced the Watcher and emerged victorious, but he knew the battle was not truly over. The balance of the ridge had been shifted, but it was not yet fully restored. As he gazed up at the heart tree, Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude and purpose. The forest had chosen him, and he had answered its call. But there was still much work to be done. The echoes of the ridge would guide him, and he would continue to protect and nurture the land that had given him so much. The forest was alive, and it would endure. And so would Ethan. Ethan Redhawk knelt before the heart tree, the talisman glowing faintly in his hand. The clearing was quiet now, the oppressive weight of the Watcher's presence replaced by an almost sacred stillness. Yet, he knew his task was far from complete. The forest had not yet healed, and the Watcher's anguish lingered like an echo reverberating through the ridge. To restore the balance, Ethan had to take one final step, a step that would bind him to the forest forever. The heart tree stood as a sentinel, its glowing symbols pulsing softly in rhythm with the land's energy. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the vibrations wash over him. He felt the forest's pain, a deep and ancient sorrow born of centuries of exploitation and neglect. The ridge had been scarred, and those scars would not fade easily. Grandfather Nez's voice echoed in his mind, guiding him. "The forest is alive, Ethan. It feels. It remembers. And it forgives, but only when given reason to trust again. Ethan placed the talisman at the base of the heart tree, its glow merging with the tree's light. He began to chant, the words flowing from him like a river. They were not his own, they came from the forest itself, carried to him on the wind. The chant wove together the elements of the ridge, the earth beneath him, the air around him, the fire of the talisman's glow, and the water that coursed through the roots of the ancient tree. As his chant grew stronger, the symbols on the tree flared to life, their light weaving intricate patterns across the clearing. The ground trembled, and the hum of the forest grew into a crescendo. Ethan opened his eyes to see the Watcher reappear, its shadowy form more defined, its glowing eyes filled not with rage but with something resembling sorrow. The Watcher stood motionless, its massive form towering over Ethan. The talisman's light reflected in its eyes, creating an almost mirror-like effect. Ethan rose to his feet, his gaze meeting the Watcher's. For the first time, he saw not a creature of vengeance but a being burdened by its role as protector. "You've carried this alone for too long," Ethan said, his voice steady. "But you don't have to anymore. Let me help you. Let us heal this forest together." The Watcher tilted its head, the glow in its eyes dimming slightly. It stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Ethan stood his ground, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. The creature extended one massive claw, its tip hovering just above the talisman. The light intensified, enveloping both Ethan and the Watcher in a radiant glow. Ethan felt the forest's energy surge through him, a torrent of emotions and memories that threatened to overwhelm him. He saw flashes of the ridge as it once was a place of harmony and abundance, where the spirits of the land and its inhabitants coexisted in balance. He also saw the moments that broke that balance, trees felled without thought, rivers poisoned, and the heart tree scarred by greed. Through it all, the Watcher had stood as a sentinel, bearing the weight of the forest's pain. Its form had been twisted by centuries of anger and betrayal, but at its core, it remained a guardian. Ethan understood now that the Watcher's fury was not born of malice but of a desperate desire to protect what remained. The light from the talisman and the heart tree merged into a single, pulsating beam that shot upward, piercing the canopy and illuminating the night sky. The Watcher let out a low, mournful sound, its shadowy form dissolving into tendrils of mist that swirled around the tree before vanishing into the air. Ethan sank to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The talisman lay before him, its glow extinguished but its warmth lingering. The forest was silent, but it was a silence filled with peace, as though the ridge itself were exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. He looked up at the heart tree, its symbols now dim but intact. The tree's bark was no longer scarred, it appeared whole, its roots firmly anchored in the earth. The energy that had once been chaotic and fractured now felt calm and unified. Ethan spent the rest of the night tending to the clearing. He arranged stones in a protective circle around the heart tree, using the symbols he had learned from Nez to ensure the balance would hold. He placed offerings of sage, cedar, and water at the base of the tree, whispering prayers of gratitude and renewal. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting a golden glow over the clearing. The forest felt alive in a way Ethan had never experienced before. Birds began to sing, their melodies weaving through the trees like a symphony. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of pine and earth. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the heart tree. The ridge had been scarred, but it would heal. He had seen to that. The Watcher was gone, its burden lifted, but its presence remained a part of the forest, a reminder of the cost of neglecting the land. When Ethan returned to Red Cedar, the townsfolk greeted him with a mix of relief and curiosity. They had sensed the change in the forest, though they couldn't explain it. The oppressive weight that had hung over the ridge was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and renewal. Grandfather Nez met Ethan at the edge of town, his expression one of quiet pride. "The forest is at peace," Nez said. "And so are you." Ethan nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "It's not over, though. There's still work to be done." "The work never ends," Nez replied. "But you are no longer alone in it." Ethan spent the following weeks repairing trails, planting saplings, and teaching the townsfolk about the importance of respecting the ridge. He shared the stories of the forest's history, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. The heart tree became a place of reverence, its clearing a sanctuary where people could connect with the land and reflect on their place within it. As the seasons changed, so did the ridge. Wildlife returned in abundance, rivers flowed clear and strong, and the trees stood tall and proud. The forest had begun to heal, and so had Ethan. He felt a deep connection to the land, a bond that went beyond duty or responsibility. The ridge was a part of him, and he was a part of it. One evening, as Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, he heard a familiar sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. He turned and saw a pair of glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. They were not threatening but watchful, a silent acknowledgement of his role as guardian. Ethan smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. The watcher was gone, but its spirit remained, woven into the fabric of the ridge. The forest was alive, and it would endure. And so would he. The forest had changed, and so had Ethan Redhawk. As he walked through the ridge, the land seemed to hum with renewed energy. The trees stood taller, their leaves greener and more vibrant. Streams that had once run dry now flowed with crystal-clear water, their melodies harmonizing with the songs of birds. Wildlife had returned in abundance, and the oppressive silence that once choked the ridge had been replaced with the lively chorus of a thriving ecosystem. Ethan felt the transformation in his very bones. The ridge had accepted him not just as a ranger, but as its guardian, a role he had once resisted but now embraced fully. The Watcher's departure had marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. While its physical presence was gone, its essence remained intertwined with the forest, a silent reminder of the consequences of neglect and the power of reconciliation. Back in Red Cedar, the townsfolk noticed the change in Ethan. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his connection to the ridge evident in the way he spoke about the forest and its needs. He had always been respected as a ranger, but now he was seen as something more, a bridge between the human world and the natural one. Ethan made it his mission to educate the community about the importance of preserving the ridge. He organized gatherings at the town hall, where he shared stories of the forest's history and its significance to their way of life. He spoke of the heart tree, the sacred clearing, and the balance that had been restored. His words carried weight, and the townsfolk listened, their attitudes toward the forest shifting from indifference to reverence. Grandfather Nez played a vital role in these gatherings, his wisdom anchoring Ethan's message. Together, they taught the community how to coexist with the forest, emphasizing respect and stewardship over exploitation. They revived old traditions, holding ceremonies to honor the land and its spirits. These rituals became a source of pride for Red Cedar, a way for its people to reconnect with their roots and foster a sense of unity. Ethan's days were filled with activity. He repaired trails damaged by years of neglect, planted saplings in areas where trees had been cut down, and worked to clear debris from streams and rivers. He spent hours mapping the ridge, identifying areas that needed protection and those that could be carefully cultivated. His efforts were tireless, driven by a sense of purpose that made the work feel less like a burden and more like a calling. The heart tree became a focal point of his efforts. Ethan returned to the clearing often, ensuring that the protective circle of stones remained intact and that offerings were placed at the tree's base. Each visit felt like a pilgrimage, a chance to reaffirm his bond with the forest and to draw strength from its energy. One afternoon, as Ethan tended to the clearing, a group of children from Red Cedar arrived with their parents. They had heard about the heart tree from Ethan's stories and wanted to see it for themselves. Ethan welcomed them, guiding them through the forest and teaching them about its plants and animals. When they reached the clearing, the children's eyes widened with wonder at the sight of the glowing symbols on the tree's bark. "This is the heart of the ridge," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "It's more than just a tree. It's a reminder of how everything in the forest is connected. If we take care of it, it will take care of us." The children nodded solemnly, their awe evident. One of them, a young girl named Clara, stepped forward and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the tree. Ethan smiled, touched by the gesture. As the seasons changed, Ethan saw the fruits of his labor. The ridge flourished, its resilience a testament to the power of renewal. The townsfolk began to see the forest not as a resource to be exploited, but as a partner in their survival. They worked alongside Ethan to plant trees, build protective barriers, and monitor wildlife populations. The ridge had become a source of pride for Red Cedar, a symbol of what could be achieved when people and nature worked in harmony. But Ethan knew that his work was never truly finished. The balance he had fought so hard to restore was fragile, and it would require constant vigilance to maintain. He accepted this responsibility with humility, knowing that the ridge had given him more than he could ever repay. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, watching the sky turn shades of gold and crimson. The ridge stretched out before him, its pines silhouetted against the fading light. He felt a deep sense of peace, a connection to the land that was both grounding and uplifting. As he turned to head back to town, he heard a sound that made him pause, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. He turned back toward the forest and saw them, two glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. They were not threatening but watchful, a silent acknowledgement of his role as guardian. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. The watcher was gone, but its spirit remained, woven into the fabric of the ridge. It was a reminder that balance was not a destination but a journey, one that required constant care and attention. He placed a hand on the talisman hanging around his neck, its surface warm against his skin. It was a symbol of his bond with the forest, a connection that would guide him for the rest of his days. The ridge was alive, and it would endure. And so would he. Ethan's legacy as the guardian of the ridge grew over the years. Children who had once marveled at his stories grew up to become stewards of the forest, their actions inspired by his teachings. The heart tree remained a place of reverence, its clearing a sanctuary for all who sought solace and connection. The forest, in turn, thrived. Its rivers flowed clear and strong, its trees reached for the sky, and its wildlife flourished. The ridge had been scarred, but it had healed, and it stood as a testament to the resilience of nature and the power of reconciliation. As the years passed, Ethan continued his work, guided by the echoes of the forest and the spirit of the watcher. He knew that the balance he had fought to restore was not just about the ridge but about the relationship between humanity and the natural world. It was a lesson he carried with him always, a truth as enduring as the forest itself. The ridge had chosen him, and he had answered its call. And in doing so, he had found not just a purpose but a home, a place where he belonged. And in the whispers of the pines and the song of the rivers, the ridge whispered its gratitude, a quiet promise that it would stand as long as there were those willing to protect it.